Hi, Santiago from Upsafe here. In this video, we will learn more about item view slot containers. Here we have a simple scene with a character that can move and pick up items. We want to display those items in the UI. To do this, we can use our item designer editor. First, go to the Setup tab and create a canvas if you don't have any in your scene. This will create an inventory canvas with a display panel manager which must reference our character. If it does not, please drag and drop your character here. Now we can start adding our inventory components or UI components under this canvas. Here we can go to Inventory Grid and choose a parent transform, which will be our inventory canvas. We can choose a panel for our inventory grid. We have basic, which is a simple without any fancy UI. We have a simple, which has a bit of UI. We have a floating panel, which allows us to move the panel as if it was a window. And we have a main menu if we wish to add the panel to the main menu. For now, we'll use floating. We have a panel menu name, which we can use here. We must reference our inventory, which is our character inventory. We can now choose a grid type. We have a grid, a list, and an item shape grid. You can look in the description or the documentation to see what it looks like. For example, inventory grid will be this sort of grid. An inventory list will look like this, and the inventory grid item shape will allow us to use item with different shapes. The inventory grid and inventory list uses the same components, but the inventory grid item shape is slightly more complicated and will have its own video tutorial. So we have decided to choose a simple grid. We can choose the grid size and then press create. As you can see, this created a simple panel and we can test it if we press play. As we entered play, our UI just disappeared. That's because the UI is usually disabled by default. You can enable it by default by selecting the Start Enabled or Open on Start. For debugging purposes, we can right-click on our display panel and press Smart Open. As you can see, we have a floating panel, so we can now move our window everywhere. And if we pick up items, they'll be added in our inventory grid. There are a few problems here. One, we can't open the panel without going to in the inspector. Also, when we move the character, it moves the selection in the grid. And we cannot see items we pick up more than what we have here in this grid. Let's see how to fix all of those. First, we'll add a button that can open our panel. We'll do UI, button, and in the onClick, we'll take our panel, drop it here, and find the display panel, and press Smart Open. There you go. Now we should have a button that can be used to open our panel. Let's place it somewhere else. There you go. We need to make sure that our panel does not get selected as we move the character. To do this, we have here a field called Gameplay Panel. And when this field is set, whenever the Gameplay Panel is selected, we can make sure that our character listens to that event, and we can enable and disable the character input. As you can see here, in our character inventory standard input, we have this field called enable character input on gameplay panel selected. And all we need to do now is make sure that this field is set. So we'll create a UI panel. Call it gameplay panel. We'll add a display panel, which must be open on start and start enabled. And we'll also add a display panel selector, which allows us to select the panel with a hover or with a click. This is very useful to make sure that our gameplay panel is selected to activate the input for the character. The selection can only happen if we have an image in the background, which can be set to alpha, or instead of an image, we can remove this component and add a raycast target, which is the same thing as an image, instead it doesn't draw anything on the screen. We now have our gameplay panel. We'll put it at the very back of our UI and we'll set it in this field. Now let's see if it works. We can move our character, we can open our panel, move our panel, and now that we're selected here in the panel, we can move our cursor without moving character. And if we move the character, oh, the selection still moves in the UI. This is because we have a component here on the inventory canvas which prevents the selectable to be deselected. This is very useful when using gamepads or only keyboard games. But in this case, we want to use both the mouse and the keyboard, so we can select this, allow this selection while the gameplay panel is selected. We can now go back in the scene, move the character, open the panel, move the character without selecting the UI, and vice versa. Great. We now have most of our things fixed. We just need to modify our grid so that it shows more items. Here in the inventory grid options, we now have selected our inventory grid. If we have multiple inventory grids in our scene, we can use this button, find available inventory grids, and there you go. We can set our size for our inventory grid, for example, add more rows or columns. We can change the layout for our grid, whether we want a grid or a list. We can add a grid navigation, for example, if we want a scrolling or buttons. Let's see what button does. Press build. As you can see, it added a button up and down. Now, if we press our inventory grid, we don't see the buttons anymore, but if we pick up more items, we'll see our little button here, and as you can see, it moves pages up and down. If we selected the scroll step, it will replace our navigation that we had before, and instead we now have a scroll on the side of the screen, on the side of our panel, which can be set to scroll. This is quite nice. We now have also filters and sorters, which we can use to sort what type of items get displayed in the screen. We also have grid tabs, which also work with filters and sorters. If you use grid tabs, they will override the default filters, so you must choose one or the other. For now, we'll choose to create some tabs. As you can see, it added 3 tabs, all called weapons. but all these tabs, they do not have a filter, so they won't do anything. Let's create one called all, add a filter, and we'll add a category filter. We now have a category filter created here, and we can set to show item categories that inherit the normal item. We now have our weapon here. We can leave it as default. We can create a tab filter, add a category filter, and set the weapons category. And here we'll choose materials, create a filter, category, and materials. We now have set all our tabs. If we wish to change the image, we can simply go here in our tabs, which are nicely selected whenever we choose them here. We can then change the icon to whatever we want. Let's choose something a bit more appropriate for this. For example, this for all the items, and this icon for the materials. There you go. We've now seen all the options specific to the inventory grid, but we also have options that are common for all the item view slot containers. The inventory grid is an item view slot container, and so is our equipment and hotbar. An item view slot container is a container that contains item view slots where items can be assigned to. If we go into the hierarchy and find our inventory grid, we will see that we have an inventory grid component which inherits the item view slots container class. If we go deeper in the hierarchy, we will see that our grid is made up of item view slots. The item view slots detect the selection, the clicks, the selection, and more. They send all these events to the item view slot container. When an item is assigned to an item view slot, we create an item view which is used to display this item in the UI. If we go in our inventory grid, we'll see that this is done with an item view drawer, which is one of the common options here. Depending on the item that is assigned to a slot, we can choose exactly what prefab will be spawned for this item view. There will be another video tutorial specific on item views. We have item actions, which can be used to add actions to an item slot whenever it is clicked or through code. If we press this plus button, we can choose whether we want our actions to be by category or for all our items. For example, if we choose a category here, we can create an item action set. Under our tutorial, we'll call it tutorial 3 category item action set. And we can add some actions. For example, we'll create one actually. Tutorial 3 item action sets. And here we can add what category will be affected. We can choose, for example, normal item. If we have troubles in the UI designer, we can always select the component. And here we can start editing again. We can choose item actions, choose an action, for example, quantity drop item action, and debug item action. We can change the order of the item action. For quantity drop, we must choose a prefab that will be spawned whenever we click. And we need to choose a prefab, which will be our item pickup that will be dropped. We can choose to remove our item, and we can add as many item actions as we want and create our own. As you can see, we have a category to choose what item will be selected or will be able to use those actions. We'll choose normal item because all the items can be dropped. We will have another video tutorial specific on item actions, which explains them in more detail. We can here add a item action panel if we want to choose what item action once we select our item. Here we create it. If we check in our hierarchy, it selected our item action panel, and we can convert it into a panel tooltip if we want to. This will make sure that when we select our item that we want to use an item action on, it will move the item action panel to somewhere relative to the item view slot. We can also add an item description, which has its own tab in the UI designer. So we can press here, and we can add an item description, either standard, small, or big. As you can see, it added our description. And an item description is actually just an item view with a bit more options. Since it is an item view, we can add item view modules and more. For this item description to work on our item view slot, we must bind it such that when we select an item view or an item view slot, it will show the item description for that item. We can take our inventory grid and drop it inside this field, press bind item view slot. We can select the component to see where it is, and it is here on the inventory grid. We can also make it into a tooltip if we want to. Now let's go back to inventory grid. We will see that we can now choose how to move it and drag and drop our items. To do this, we must have a cursor manager, which is already added by default on our canvas. And if we wish to, we can add a category item view set such that when we drag and drop, the item that moves across the screen is consistent between the item view slots. We can choose a drop handler for our inventory grid. For that, we must create an item view slot drop action, which will decide exactly what happens when you drop the item. If we select the drop handler, we will see that the item view slot we created, here the drop action set, it added automatically a condition action for moving the item and a condition action for exchanging items between the item view slots. Here you can add more conditions and actions. And for each condition and action, we have multiple conditions we can choose and actions. You can create your own conditions and actions if you want to. The way the item view drop handler works is if it passes the conditions, it will do the action and stop. If it does not pass the condition, it will move to the next to see if it passes the condition. If none of the conditions are passed, then the system will know that the item cannot be dropped, and if at least one condition passes, then that means that the item can be dropped and will. Knowing in advance if the item can be dropped or not lets us preview in the UI how the item is dropped. Here we have the drag handler that we can add if we want to drag the item from the item view slot. Otherwise, if we only have the drop handler, we will only be able to drop and not drag. The move cursor is to be able to move items in an item view slot using the keyboard only, and this works with an item action, which is special. We'll learn more about this in another video about drag and drop. We've now added most of the options to our inventory grid, and we can test it again. We can open here, and as you can see, as we move, we have our descriptions of our item. We can select different tabs, and everything works. It is not very pretty though, but this is up to you to customize how the UI looks. We can now add other item view slots, which is very easy. For example, our equipment. We can choose our canvas. We'll choose another floating window. We can choose our panel name. We must drag and drop our inventory. And the equipment requires an item slot set, which we can create. For default, we could just take the one from the demo scene or one that I already created in advance. As you can see, each field has a name and a category. Before we create this, we must check that our character has in the inventory an item collection with this item slot set. So we can create here item collection, call it equipment, choose an item slots collection for the type, and choose the purpose as equipped. We'll choose the item slot set to be the exact same that we selected here. We can now press create, and this will have created our equipment UI. We can move things around a little bit. There you go. We can now add a hotbar if we want. Inventory canvas. And there you go. We now have 3 item view slot containers, one for our inventory, one for our equipment, and one for our hotbar. As you can see, the equipment also has the common options for the item view slots containers, and so does the hotbar. We'll be adding a drop handler for equipment and for hotbar as well. There you go. If you want to select the item view slot for equipment, we can do so very easily here, just to make sure that, for example, our right hand, which accepts weapons, as you can see here, is this item view slot set, or item view slot, sorry. Before pressing play, let's take all these panels and put it under the gameplay panel. We'll take the button, duplicate it, move it a bit up, and use it to open our equipment panel with Smart Toggle. Let's press play. We can move our character, open the inventory, we can pick up items, we can also use the item actions, for example debug or drop. We can open the equipment panel here, where we can drag and drop our items that we wish to equip. And as you see, we can preview whether or not we're able to drop the item in this slot with a green or red background. The color red and green is actually set up in the item view, and you can actually change what the item view looks like in all the stages, whether it is here on the source of the selection, while the item is being dragged, and when the item is dropped. There are special interfaces that can be used to change the view for all of these stages. We can drag and drop items in our hotbar, and it gets automatically updated if we, for example, drop the item. As you can see, the amount went from 1 to 0. That is all about item view slot containers. You can learn more about item view slot containers in the documentation, and I'll see you in the next video.